intimidating to introduce someone like Tarek Hassan. I met Tarek in 2001 when he came as a graduate student in Harvard, where I was teaching at the time. And in fact, Tarek was a legend long before he arrived, because in fact, he was a victim of kind of first student victim of 2001, because you were not for 4 months, no? So he said, when is Tarek coming? So every day people were asking, is Tarek here? Is that Tarek here? Because the Homeland Security was preventing Tarek from coming. And Tarek came, and it's true, he made a big impact. I mean, he's been, extremely active in this new wave of work on institutions and growth, which looks at how historical events shape current economic growth through the effect they have on, economic institutions, or by the way they interact with institutions, or sociological factors. So, to be more concrete, for example, when Tarek's paper with Robinson on the legacy of Holocaust in Russia, where they show that regions that were most severely affected by the Holocaust during World War II in Russia have worse economic outcomes today, in particular because the Holocaust in fact, decimated the middle class in those regions. So those are regions where the middle class was much less, and that has in turn have an impact on current economic outcome. Or more recently, in our QJE paper on German reunification and social ties, you show how the fall of the Berlin Wall had very different effects on different regions of West Germany, depending on the ties that those regions, on the sociologic ties that those regions had with the previous East Germany. So it's always this idea: you have an historical event, but it affects economic outcome that happened before. It affects differently outcomes today, because either because it acts through because it modifies sociological structure, or because it interacts in a particular way with sociological structure. So I see that also in the same move. I mean, as for me, like Nathan Nunn, or this new generation of institutional economists, and who look at how past event affects current outcomes. And today you are telling us about how street protests in Egypt affected the rents of previously connected firms, and so it's a pleasure to have Tarek give the lecture. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So I just came off the plane, so I'm going to find it impossible to talk without standing and gesticulating. So hopefully, especially after lunch. So also, I'm going to point over here. I know there's many monitors and it's kind of confusing, so I'm just going to use this one as my reference. Actually, do I have a clicker? Okay, great. Aha. Okay. So this is about the power of the street, evidence from Egypt's Arab Spring. It's joint work with Daron, who you all know, and in this case, I'm the et, and Ahmed is the al, 2015. Okay, so throughout recent history, corruption and favoritism have motivated people to pour into the street and to protest against the economic arrangements that benefit the few, the politically connected, both individuals and firms. And such protests have often led to the fall of unpopular regimes, not just in Egypt, but also, think about Libya or Ukraine or Tunisia. However, and I think Egypt is sort of a good example of this, it's a little unclear whether these protests have sort of the intended effect, at least proximately. Do they have the intended effect in the sense that what people are fundamentally protesting is in some sense corruption and favoritism. Yeah, so having not a level playing field for all. And the question that we're trying to answer in this paper is, can we find evidence in Egypt's Arab Spring for and against this idea that street protests actually have an effect on economic rents? Now, First, and I guess most obviously, the Mubarak regime is sort of a perfect specimen of corruption and favoritism. Yeah, so I guess there's no question that there was lots and lots of corruption both before and after the fall of Mubarak. But what makes this episode somewhat special is that, so first of all, following the 25th of January 2011, street protests break down the Mubarak regime, but then usher in an era of competition where three sort of well-known power holders in Egypt repeatedly shift in and out of power. And that's the National Democratic Party, so Mubarak's party, the Egyptian military, and the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. Now, throughout this process, street protests appear at least to continue to play an important role. So that gives us a window on sort of the differential effects of street protests on the economic value of the political connections of this changing cast of political actors. So that's the idea. So the key feature here is that you have street protests going on and that they appear instrumental throughout this period, and we have more than one group of power holders in charge. So what we're going to do is, in some sense, fairly standard. So we're going to use relative stock market valuations to learn something about political rents. In particular, we're going to look at the relative valuations of firms that we know are connected to one of the three rival groups relative to non-connected firms, firms that we do not see are politically connected, and then interpret these differences in valuations that are induced by political events as the effects of these events on rents. What makes this paper a little bit special, though, is that we're not going to look at a single event, such as the fall of Mubarak, but we're going to look at a sequence of events, which in particular is street protests in Tahrir Square against the incumbent government. So we're going to be interested in a much more high-frequency phenomenon, which is people come out to protest, and that happened quite frequently over the time period that we're interested here. Now, to the extent that we control for the sensitivity of different types of firms to macroeconomic and political risk, sort of other factors that affect their valuation, then these patterns will be informative about the market's perceptions about the effect of these political events on the relative valuation of these different firms. And in particular, in the context of EVs, we're going to call that rents. Yeah, so if things happen in the political sphere that affect the valuation of firms relative to non-connected firms and holding constant the sector and so forth, we're going to interpret that as rents changing. Okay. Oh, wrong clicker. So here are the main findings. The first main finding is fairly standard. So I'm going to show you that throughout Egypt's Arab Spring, key events in the struggle for power between the National Democratic Party, the military, and Islamists are reflected in stock returns of firms that are connected to these groups. So for example, I'm going to show you in a very simple event study that the fall of Mubarak appears to have induced abnormal returns of NDP-connected firms of minus 13%. So the fall of Mubarak appears to have caused a destruction of 13% of the valuation of the firms that were directly connected to him through the National Democratic Party.
So isn't CC a consequence of your paper? You said you should minimize turnout in protests.
I think that
I'm afraid of stock market fluctuations.
So I think that they've learned. They seem to have learned how to stop protests from happening, right? So in some sense, they seem to agree with our assessment. Yeah. So the second main finding is really the novel and I think most important finding of the paper. The first set of results is really just to basically bolster your confidence that our measures of political connections subject to the controls that we employ are actually picking up something that looks like political rents. That's the purpose of the first part of the paper. In the second part of the paper, I'm going to show you that a higher turnout of protesters in Tahrir Square is associated with lower daily stock returns of firms that are connected to the group currently in power relative to non-connected firms. So that means on the day where you have bigger street protests in Tahrir Square, you get a nosedive of firms that are connected to the current incumbent government. And who that current incumbent government is going to change over time. More importantly, or most importantly, the same protests do not appear to have an effect on the relative valuation of the rivals of the incumbent group. So that means the incumbents are going down and we don't see the other guys going up relative to non-connected firms, which is going to be our main piece of evidence in favor of the interpretation that street protests, in fact, limit the ability or limit the expected ability of political power holders to extract rents. A final set of results is going to be about social media, in particular about Twitter, where I'm going to show you that activity on Twitter predicts street protests, but appears to have no direct effect on relative valuation. So that means, essentially, what happens on Twitter doesn't matter until people actually turn out on the street as a result of mobilization on Twitter. Okay, so those are the three main findings. By the way, am I supposed to go for the entire hour, or do we have questions? Or?
No, we will have 10 minutes for questions.
So I finished.
We have more than enough time, so take all the time.
Okay, no, that's I can talk as long as you want. So. All right. So. Okay, so then in that case, I'm going to skip this slide. All right. So I guess I don't need to talk much about the related literature. There's a big literature that looks at the value of political connections and how it changes after a large political event. There's like Suharto's health scare papers. There's papers on Malaysia. There's papers on Germany. There's papers even on the US. So we have a large body of literature that basically has single events. Something happens to the probability that a certain set of people is going to stay in power, and then looks at abnormal stock returns. There's a large theoretical literature that views the threat of uprisings, and in particular, I guess, street protests, as a driving force of democratization. So you think of like game theoretic models where there's essentially a populace and there's a ruler, and the population has to solve the collective action problem in order to put constraints on the ruler. Yeah, and that's kind of how sort of a large set of papers sort of views that as the process of how you get constraints on the executive implemented. And in some sense, what we're doing here is we're investigating the reduced form of that prediction. And that's, I think, really the central contribution of the paper. There's another literature that kind of like views protests more as a negative thing through the lens of sort of costs from political instability and so forth. And then finally, there's a new literature on social media and collective action that kind of debates whether social media makes it easier or harder to solve the collective action problem. So in particular, rulers are going to be able to see what happens on Twitter. Yeah, and I think in Egypt they might have just learned exactly how that works. On the other hand, it's easier to coordinate on social media, and we'll have something to say about that as well. So, as I mentioned already, the first part of the paper is just going to be a series of event studies where we're then going to deploy our econometric toolkit to make sure that our measures of connections are actually economically valid and kind of make sense as measures of political connections. That's the first step. And during that step, I'm also going to like briefly kind of give you a roundup of the history of Egypt's Arab Spring. The second step is then to link street protests directly to our measures of economic rents. And the third step is to talk about social media and protests and how social media appear to have mobilized for these protests. All right, let me tell you first a little bit about the history. So Egyptian history is kind of usually hard to fit on a slide. So what you need to know for the purpose of this paper is that since 1952, since independence effectively, there's been a continuous power struggle between three well-known kind of groups: the Egyptian military, secular elites and cronies that are organized in the National Democratic Party, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And I guess what you need to know about the Egyptian military is that it has been a political actor for a very long time, witnessed by the fact that all presidents up to Morsi came from the military. Importantly, and this is a feature that we're going to use, it's fiscally independent, which means that the government is not in control over the balance sheet or the revenues generated by the military. So the military has a big economic empire, part of which we're going to see in our data, and the returns to this report to what's called the military till rather than to civilian till. So the military controls its own budget. The National Democratic Party is kind of a political party, has no clear ideology, I would say, and more collects cronies, bureaucrats, and the secular elite of the country. And in particular, what's interesting, it expanded its political influence relative to the military in the final years running up to 2011. The Muslim Brothers you all know about. It's an Islamist movement that has widespread support among lower classes and the urban middle class. It's outlawed, but usually operating openly. Not so much now, but at the time of the writing of the paper. All right. So this is the part where I don't know who's controlling the slides, but there's going to be a button on the slide that I need pressed. I don't know if you can hear me. So how do we figure out which firms are connected and which firms are not connected? Exactly. Okay. So all right, 1 second. So first of all, we hand collected the names of principal shareholders and directors of all publicly listed firms in Egypt, and then cross-reference these names with a list, which is called the Fulul list, a list of basically the 6,000 most important members of the National Democratic Party. Can you click? Aha. So this is no longer up. So since the military came back into power, they've removed this. But basically, you can click on your governorate here, or you used to be able to click on your governorate, and then it would give a list of names and the functions of the main actors of the National Democratic Party. Can you click on back? Thank you. Okay. So we classify a firm as connected if at least one name of a board of of a director or a principal shareholder appears on this list of NDP members. By the way, at some point, okay, yeah. So we still have this data. I'm a little conflicted about whether we should make it publicly available or not, but certainly, like, the military doesn't want it around. We classify firms as connected to the military if the firm is partially or fully owned by one of 11 holding companies that are controlled by the Egyptian military. So there's a list of holding companies controlled by the Egyptian government, and then you can go through them and look and basically figure out which one of these is controlled by the military, reporting to the military till of the budget. And basically, the way that you figure this out is if the general meeting of the board is held in a military barracks, then you say, well, you know, they're probably controlled by the military. We spent a lot of time trying to find Muslim Brothers on boards, and we found none, which sort of makes sense because, you know, these guys rationally had to expect to be thrown into jail. So what we do instead is we essentially use firms that are classified by either Zawiya or Morgan Stanley as being Sharia compliant. So this is a certification that you can get for your business, which basically says that you're a religiously run company. Okay, and altogether we have 177 firms that are listed either in Cairo or Alexandria. So I'm first going to talk about relatively standard stuff. So we're going to, for each firm, we're going to estimate, we're going to take its stock returns, and we're going to estimate a beta with respect to the world market and with respect to the Egyptian market. These are going to be controls in our specifications. We're also going to control for the size of the firm and its leverage. And one thing that's, I guess, a little bit less standard is we spend a lot of time thinking about, could there be differences across firms in how sensitive they are to political unrest in general? So what we did there is we went to a database that's called GDELT, which basically kind of gives you a list of like stuff that happened in the world. And we identified periods of strikes, blockades, and so forth that happened in Egypt over the last 15 years, and essentially regress each firm's stock return on a dummy for these periods of unrest. And then we call that coefficient the unrest beta, so the firm's sensitivity to unrest. And we're going to use that as a control in our specifications as well. Altogether, 177 firms, 22 by our measures are connected to the National Democratic Party, 33 to the military, and 13 are Sharia compliant. For ease of reference, I'm going to call them Islamic connected, although that's sort of like an abuse of the English language. Of the 13 Islamic connected firms, 5 are also connected to the National Democratic Party. Interestingly, there's no overlap whatsoever between National Democratic Party and military connected firms, which is in line with this civilian till, military till of the government sort of philosophy. Okay. Here's sort of like what it looks like by sector. So as you might have expected, sort of the national NDP connected firms are kind of all over the economy. Maybe more surprisingly, the military is in all kinds of things, right? So they're in consumer goods, food and bev, the biggest chicken producer, pasta. You might have thought that they make tanks, but that's like a very small sort of part of what they do. They have hotels, they have all kinds of stuff. Okay, so they're all over the map. Islamic connected firms, by the nature of what we have here, are going to be mainly financial and real estate firms, but there's some in other sectors as well. All of our results are going to be conditional on sector fixed effects. So I'm always going to always make comparisons within sector here. All right, so now how did we figure out the main variable of interest is going to be the number of people demonstrating in Tahrir Square on any given day. And that is actually not super easy to figure out. So what we did is we used essentially world newspapers as well as many digital English language Egyptian newspapers as we could find, scraped all of that content, and then looked for, we wrote an algorithm that basically snoops and looks for what does the newspaper say about how many people are in Tahrir Square on that day. And that's sort of like, a lot of programming that you have to do, but it's doable. And we end up with basically a time series for 200 newspapers, and for each day a number that they report. Most of the time it's going to be 0. Other times it's going to be, so they're going to say things like thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, and so forth. Then we map these words to numbers and take the median after kind of like doing a bunch of other stuff, and then what you get is this. So I was told by a referee that this is a very bad graph. So what this is supposed to show is the timeline of Egypt's Arab Spring, and then for each day the number of protesters. And you see here it's capped at 500,000 because essentially when they say hundreds of thousands, we say it's 500,000. But what you see here is there's a bunch of spikes. So the first phase of Egypt's Arab Spring works up to Mubarak's fall. Yeah, so Mubarak falls from power. The next phase is military rule. There's a period of relative calm, although there's protests going on in Tahrir Square the entire time. And then when it looks like the military is getting comfortable and doesn't want to hold elections, there's another spike that forces elections. There's then elections that, the first and the second round of presidential elections that then get Morsi into power. It's followed by a phase of Islamist rule, where Mohammed Morsi is in power for exactly 1 year. There's a spike of protests around passing of the constitution, and then another spike that boots Morsi out of office. Then we have a small sample period of 1 month that we call post-Islamist rule. That is the period of transition towards the second round of military rule. These are the 4 phases: Mubarak's fall, military rule, Islamist rule, post-Islamist rule, that I'll be referring to frequently. These here are the numbers for Tahrir Square. At some point, in particular during the post-Islamist period, Islamist protesters splinter off and go to what's called Rabaa Square. But we then do this exact same thing for Rabaa Square. What we benefit from here is that generally throughout this time period, the intent of protesters is highly correlated with where they are. If you're in Tahrir Square, you're generally against the government. If you're in Rabaa Square, you're generally for the Islamists, and the only period where that sort of breaks down is the Islamist rule period, where on some days you have the Muslim Brotherhood demonstrating, on other days you have secular protesters demonstrating, and you're going to see that in our results. Okay, so now let me show you briefly our event study results. And again, these are a prelude for the main results. We're doing this mainly to make you comfortable with the idea that our measures of connections are actually picking up real things. So they're picking up connections to these power holders, and moreover, we see effects that look like rents moving around in response to political shocks. Okay, so in these specifications, I'm going to calculate the cumulative return for each firm between the start date of the event and the end date of the event, and then regress this cumulative return on a vector of dummies reflecting the affiliation to which of the groups the firm is connected, and our controls. And the controls, as I mentioned already, include a world market beta, Egyptian market beta, and unrest beta, the full set of sector fixed effects, and controls for size and leverage. The main identifying assumption for, so what do we want to figure out? We want to figure out this vector gamma, which is the effect of the event on the relative valuation of firms connected to the group NDP, military, Islamic, relative to non-connected firms. And the main identifying assumption for this vector gamma here is that absent a political event, there are no systematic differences between the returns of the different types of connected firms and non-connected firms. And this is the identifying assumption that I'm going to corroborate in some detail. As one does with these studies, we adjust our standard errors for cross-firm correlation and also use a bunch of other stuff to basically establish that this is the right thing to look at. Now, I'm going to interpret this coefficient gamma as the effect of the event on market participants' expectation of the net present value of economic rents accruing to the three types of connected firms. Now, I won't be able to distinguish rents from discrimination. Yeah, so it might well be that if your guys are not in power, you get discriminated against. Yeah, so these rents could be positive or negative. What we're seeing is basically just the net absolute movement. Okay. So let me go briefly through the history. I think most of the people in the room are going to have some recollection of what happened here. So Mubarak was in power since 1981. Then in December of 2010, unrest begins in Tunisia and very quickly spills over to Egypt. The first large protest in Tahrir Square is on the 25th of January. Hosni Mubarak resigns on the 11th of February. Right? So it's very quickly we get to a situation where there's escalating protests in Tahrir Square and he's pushed out of power. Okay, so what I'm looking at here is the cumulative return on 8 trading days surrounding the fall of Mubarak. Now, because the exchange was closed for much of that period, this is actually like a 2-month period, but only 8 trading days. The dependent variable here is the cumulative return, and I'm regressing that first of all on my dummies for NDP, military, Islamic. And then in our standard specification, we control for world market beta, Egyptian market beta, unrest beta, size, and leverage, as well as sector fixed effects. This is our standard specification. In this standard specification, the effect of the fall of Mubarak is an abnormal return of minus 13% for NDP connected firms. And you see not much happening to the other firms. In some specifications, you see a positive effect on the military, which would make sense if people anticipated the military now coming in power, but no effect on Islamic connected firms in any of these specifications. So what this means is that...
sorry, wait.
Yeah.
Can you go back? In the last specification, you do have an effect on the...
Right. I guess it's not super robust. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah. So basically what I want to see from this from this table is that basically what's happening is conforms to my prejudice that the fall of Mubarak is going to be bad for firms that are connected to him. That's the only thing I want to take away from. Whether or not there's positive or negative effects on others doesn't really matter for my interpretation here. Just to give you an idea, so 13.1 percentage points is something like $2.8 billion, or 5% of market capitalization. So it's a rather big effect. Now, we do a bunch of things to corroborate that this is indeed the causal effect of sort of Mubarak falling. The way that you do that is you basically look at, days where Mubarak doesn't fall, and you hope that you don't find a significant coefficient, which is exactly what you find. Yeah? So insignificant coefficients on non-treatment days in that sense, and then Mubarak falls and boom, this happens. You can do a lot of work with synthetic matching estimators and blah, 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 and doing all this other stuff that then also ends up looking exactly the same, so whatever. And more robustness checks. One thing that you want to see is that sort of when other events of unrest happen, so when other kind of things happen that that shouldn't affect the relative valuation of one group, then you don't want to see any significant coefficients on those days. Yeah, so we have basically in the paper a series of event studies, placebo events, where we show that basically on other days where there's just strikes or there's a massacre that's not political, or where the state of emergency is extended and so forth. In fact, also the Tunisian unrest starts. You don't see these coefficients loading on anything. Now this is followed by some Mubarak falls. Now we have the military in power, and the military is sort of like quite happy about being in power until sort of they get annoyed with the protesters in Tahrir Square and kick them out of Tahrir Square. That's the next event that we're looking at here. So when protesters are kicked out of Tahrir Square forcefully, we get a positive and marginally significant effect on military-connected firms, which sort of like is in line with what you might have expected. A following event is then when protesters retake Tahrir Square, kick the military out of Tahrir Square, and you see on that day a negative and significant effect on military-connected firms. So what I want you to see here is these two big events that clearly change the relative power of the military, and it shows up in the relative valuation of firms that are connected to the military relative to non-connected firms. We then have presidential elections where no clear pattern emerges. Mohamed Morsi emerges victorious from these presidential elections and then consolidates his power by sacking the generals, by basically kicking the generals out. And you see on that day a positive abnormal return on Islamic connected firms relative to non-connected firms. Yeah, so again, power grab by the Islamists, good for Islamic connected firms. And then you see similar things in other events. For example, when Morsi is then finally sacked, you see this reversed. Yes, you see a negative abnormal return on Islamic connected firms. So what I want you to get from this is that firms that are connected to a given group increase in value when the group gains power in general, across these different events, and that's consistent with the view that shifts in political power are priced in the Egyptian market. Okay, now the end of the story, I guess you all know. Mohamed Morsi gets booted out of power. There's protests going on in Rabaa Square and in Tahrir Square for and against the new military government. Eventually the military bulldozes the Islamists in Rabaa Square, and that's the end of protests in Egypt so far. Recently there's been a few more protests or attempts. So we then corroborate these results by looking at some other data that is not stock market data where these rents or anticipation of these rents might be showing up. So for example, what I show you here in the first panel is that sort of pre-revolution you have 19 NDP members on boards and 21 military members on boards of firms. And then when the military comes to power, they start firing the NDP guys and hiring military guys. And then when the Islamists come to power, they start firing both of those. As I mentioned before, we haven't found any Muslim Brothers on boards. Yeah, mainly probably because they wouldn't want to make these connections very obvious. However, when you look at profitability data and look at how does profitability of these different types of connected firms evolve, you see that so pre-revolution, the NDP-connected firms are most profitable. During military rule, the military-connected firms are most profitable. During Islamist rule, it somewhat reverses, and the Islamic firms appear to be the most profitable among the connected firms, although non-connected firms appear to be doing quite well. So I take this table as sort of corroborating the results from the stock return data that indeed it looks like rents are shifting around here over time.
Who is that single person?
I forgot. Yeah, I should know. He's in the paper. Okay, so now I can get to the main result. I'm now taking this as license for a much more ambitious specification, where I'm now going to use the entire panel data set. So far it was always, just the return differential on before and after an event. Now we're going to look at a series of events, and that series of events is protests in Tahrir Square and the number of protesters in Tahrir Square, where I regress the return of firm I at time t on my vector of connected dummies. This is now a control, so I'm not going to interpret that. The main variable of interest here is the coefficients that we get on the interaction between the number of protesters in Tahrir Square and the military, NDP, and Islamic dummies. So this means the differential effect of protests on one given day of protests in Tahrir Square on the relative valuations of NDP, military, and Islamic connected firms. That's what we're going to estimate. Then we're going to have a flexible set of controls where I have all the controls that I mentioned before interacted with time-fixed effects. So we have a fully flexible specification. We have time-fixed effects and sector-fixed effects. Now, this vector gamma p here measures the effect of protests on the value of connected firms, subject to an identifying assumption. Number one, no omitted variables fluctuate at the daily frequency and are correlated with both the return and the number of protesters. That's the main thing that you have to believe, that there's nothing else that moves around so fast. Yeah, so in some sense, what we're thinking here is what moves around at a very high frequency is your ability to solve the collective action problem and get people into Tahrir Square. That changes every day. What doesn't change every day is your discontent with the government and things like that. Yeah? So we can't have omitted variables that move both relative returns and the number of protesters in Tahrir Square, and I'm going to show you some evidence for that. The second thing, I'm just going to assume that there's no reverse causality from differential daily stock returns to protests. That would be somewhat crazy, right? So the people protest because NDP-connected firms are doing badly today. Probably not. Okay, so here's sort of the raw form of the main results. I'm going to show you a more pointed version of this in a minute. So I'm now running this regression separately for Mubarak's fall, military rule, Islamist rule, and the post-Islamist rule. And what you see here is, in the first specification, a negative and highly significant effect on the interaction between NDP-connected firms and Tahrir protesters. While Mubarak is in power, more protesters in Tahrir Square. The way to interpret this coefficient here means 500,000 extra people in Tahrir Square lowers the relative valuation of NDP-connected firms by 1.6 percentage points relative to non-connected firms. You see, by contrast, no effect on the relative valuations of their rivals relative to non-connected firms. A similar pattern emerges during military rule. During military rule, if there's more people in Tahrir Square protesting, no significant effect on NDP or Islamic connected firms, but a negative and highly significant effect on military connected firms. So that means while the military is in power, more people in Tahrir Square is bad for military connected firms. During Islamist rule, this pattern breaks down. And I've already speculated that might be because on some days you have Islamists protesting, on others you have secular people protesting, and there's no clear mapping between the number of people in Tahrir Square and the intent of protesters. However, during the post-Islamist period, the pattern reemerges. Number of people in Tahrir Square is negative related to the relative valuation of Islamic connected firms. So people in Tahrir Square are against the Islamists. You see a negative and significant effect here, a marginally significant effect. And then, if you look at the protesters for the Islamists in Rabaa Square, you get a positive and significant effect. So in some sense, what we're after here is this diagonal. Yeah? So whenever you're in power, more people protesting against you is bad for you. Yeah? And then what we want to see is, off the diagonal, is there a systematic effect or not? If there wasn't a systematic effect off the diagonal, it would mean protests just shift around the rents. There's a fixed amount of rents, and if people protest against the government, the rivals just get that relative valuation, anticipation of future rents. If there's nothing off the diagonal, then that would suggest that these protesters are actually destroying rents. Yes, destroying the capacity of connected firms to extract rents relative to non-connected firms. What I'm going to do now in this spirit is I'm going to pool my data across all of these four phases, and I'm going to assign only two dummies. One is, you're politically connected and incumbent, which means you're in power. So in the first period, it's going to be the NDP. In the second period, it's going to be the military. In the third period, it's going to be Islamists. In the fourth period, it's also going to be the Islamists in the sense that people in Tahrir Square are protesting against you. The second dummy is going to be one if you're connected to one of the three groups but not in power. So then what we're interested in is the interaction between the number of protesters in Tahrir Square and the incumbent dummy, as well as the number of people in Tahrir Square and the connected non-incumbent dummy. So when I run this regression, what I find is a negative and highly significant effect on the incumbent times protesters interaction and no systematic effect on their rivals. So what this means is that systematically across all the phases of Egypt's Arab Spring, more people in Tahrir Square gives a negative abnormal return to the incumbent on that day, but no positive offsetting return to their rivals. So which is what you would expect if investors believe that the government's ability to extract rent is diminished by the number of people protesting on that day. Now, interestingly, so we kind of beat up on this specification quite a lot. In fact, I gave you a little sort of like overview of major events that happened during Egypt's Arab Spring, including changes in government and so forth. Let me take all of the events that I've mentioned so far and drop them as well as a bunch of days around them from the sample.
I should not interrupt, but because if they were in competing sectors, there, reducing the rents of one would increase. So it means that they are in different sectors. That I guess, no, the fact that you reduce the rents of the connected without affecting the rents of the non-connected. If there were competitors in the same sectors, there in that case, you could imagine that what is bad for one could be good for the other.
Yes. So
it's because they operate in different sectors. Probably it's linked to that.
No, or the rents are disappearing. Exactly. Right. So
it's just a rent. It's a pure rent.
You can destroy rents or you can create rents.
Yeah. So you're right that these results are not consistent with just purely competitive effects.
Yeah.
So they're consistent with the rents drying up, expected rents drying up. Now, what I wanted to point out is you might think that sort of Mubarak's fall and big events are sort of important for identifying this coefficient. They're not. Okay, all the events that I've mentioned so far, I can drop as many days as you want from the sample and look at, in some sense, only more look at politically stable periods where it was very clear that the government wasn't going to change and nothing big happens except for there's a big protest, and you get exactly the same coefficient. Yeah, I'm dropping half my sample here, and the coefficient doesn't move. So interestingly, this relationship exists even in the absence of big political events. Okay, so now let me. Okay, so I think I've kind of said all this. So
How do we measure the magnitude? The magnitude of the coefficient?
So 500,000 people minus 0.8 percentage points on that day.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a single day kind of coefficient. It measures the impact on a single day. Okay. Yeah, so if 500,000 people come on the next day as well, you get another 0.8 percentage points. Exactly. So the main challenge to this interpretation, that it might be that news about the government's performance may affect certain types of firms while also triggering protests. So there might be an unobserved variable that both kind of affects the relative valuations of these firms and pushes out people to the street to protest. So there's various ways of addressing that issue. One is through sort of like, kind of careful inclusion of controls and so forth. So importantly, you can put like a sector and time effect in here. So what that means is that you're allowing the productivity of firms in each sector to vary differentially on each day. Yeah, so I'm completely taking out, okay, whatever. So you can do lots of stuff with controls. What I think is more kind of most convincing is a Granger causality. I shouldn't say Granger causality. I'm not allowed to say Granger causality. A timing, looking at the timing of the effect. And so if there was a third variable moving around, news about the government's performance and at the same time the relative productivity of these firms, then you would expect to see some of that at least on the day before. Yeah, so it's quite implausible that the timing of that would be precisely in lockstep with the timing of the protests. You know, for one thing, people are more likely to protest, you know, in the afternoon than in the morning and so forth. So, okay. So what you see here is if you put the lead, so if I put future protests in here, there's no correlation. And I think that's probably the most convincing piece of evidence. When I put in today's protests, I recover my negative and significant effect on the incumbent times protesters' interactions, and I find no effect on the other connected firms. If you put in the lag, you find that the following day has a big effect as well, which makes sense because a lot of the protests kind of peak after trading hours. Yeah, but then if you go past the second lag, you find no effect. So the timing of these effects is highly supportive, I think, of viewing this as a causal effect on rents. Okay. So, yeah, please.
So I'm wondering how to interpret this. So it seems that there's a direct reaction to protests. Fine.
Yes, on that day. So
Absolutely.
People come out to protest. A differential effect on firms that are connected to the government on that day, but not before.
But what is the theory? Shouldn't people be looking at trends and deviations from trends as informative signals about the probability that the system may change, rather than the instantaneous outcomes in the street?
Okay, so I think what this tells you is that first of all, the street protests have real effects.
Fine.
Right? Now, there's two interpretations, and we're very clear in the paper that we're not going to be able to distinguish between them. One interpretation is this means that investors think that there's going to be a future change in de jure power that involves better institutions in the sense that there's going to be less rent seeking. So people expect there's going to be a constitution and so forth. Another interpretation is the fact that people protested on that day is a form of de facto power. So even if you don't get the constitutional change that basically makes sure that there's no stealing in the future, there's still some of that effect because in the future politicians are going to be scared of the street. And I think both of these are interesting interpretations because it has sort of they imply non-trivial effects of these protests that somehow end up reducing the total amount of rents. Now, I can also tell you, like up front, one challenge to this that we were not going to be able to address is it's possible that the sliver of economic interests of the military, for example, that we see in our sample is not representative of military interests off the stock exchange. Yeah, so if the rents shift off the stock exchange in a systematic way, then we're not going to see that here. So if rents shift off the stock exchange and firms off the stock exchange that are connected to military, for example, are systematically different from those that are on the exchange. That's the main challenge to that interpretation. But so what I want to emphasize here is that the intent of protesters has real effects. Yeah, so if the effect of protest was just through chaos, then you would see no effect on our coefficients. Instead, the the protesters are angry at somebody, and the fact that it's directed against the government lowers the valuation of firms that are connected to the incumbent relative to non-connected firms. And again, that's sort of consistent with the view that de facto power emanating from street protests curtails the total amounts of rents accruing to connected firms in the future. All right, so let me spend maybe, I guess I should finish, right? So
still, yeah, 10 minutes, if we can you go? 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll take 5 minutes to just talk about the social media stuff because it's kind of fun. So let me kind of just like, a more subtle point here is does it matter that people are unhappy or does it matter that they go out onto the street? So Twitter kind of gives you a nice way of measuring how unhappy are people with the government today. Yeah, a measure at the same frequency as the protests. So what we do is we download the entire history of tweets made by, as far as we can tell, the universe of Egyptian Twitter users. So 300 million tweets during that period. And we count two things. The first thing that we count is the retweets, so basically repeating what members of the 3 different power holders are saying. Yeah, so how much resonance does, for example, do the Islamists have on Twitter on that day? How much resonance does the military have on Twitter on that day, for example? So that's a measure of the political support for the opposition. The second thing that we measure is the number of tweets that have a Tahrir hashtag or say something about Tahrir Square in them, which we then interpret as a measure of the mobilization for turning out in the street. So how much are we tweeting about protesting? So the first, as a sense check, I'm regressing the daily number of protesters on the lag of tweets that have the Tahrir hashtag or that say something about Tahrir in them. And you see here that the number of Tahrir hashtags predicts the number of people in Tahrir Square. So this is consistent with the view that Twitter is playing some role in mobilizing people. People communicate on that platform and agree, yes, tomorrow we're going to turn out so that none of us turn out alone. Yeah, so that's sort of, that's consistent with that view. The same is true for the retweets of the opposition. Yeah, the more unhappy we are with the government, the more we protest on the next day. But if you put both of these 2 variables together, very clearly sort of the Tahrir hashtags that are supposed to measure mobilization predict mobilization better. I then take both of these 2 measures and just throw them into the regression that I just showed you, into the main specification, where the dependent variable now are, again, daily stock returns. And now I want to see whether the Tahrir hashtags capture the same variation that the protests capture. And let me emphasize here, Tahrir hashtags are counted with almost 100% accuracy. So if anything, you would think that the number of protesters is measured with much more error. So if I do a horse race between the number of protesters and the Tahrir hashtags, very clearly the number of protesters here, so in some sense our main results don't change if I put the Tahrir hashtags into this regression. So which is consistent with the timing results I showed you earlier, right? Because the Tahrir hashtags come earlier. Yeah, in some sense, investors could have read the Tahrir hashtags and had the stock market reaction right then, but it turns out the stock market only reacts when people actually come out onto the street. Yeah?
So why is it not very efficient that this is just a breakdown of repression?
Sorry, can you say again?
My interpretation of this is just a breakdown of repression. So I'm a government, I want to have a protest. Often I succeed, sometimes I don't. When I don't, it's painful. When I do, this is usual.
So if this is just a breakdown, so now I think these are just different words. So breakdown of oppression in this context here means that the firms that are connected to me are the ones that are benefiting from the oppression, and those are the firms that are losing value. So I think breakdown of oppression is kind of this, I would say it's almost the same thing.
So, I mean, in a way, you know, the protests, if you read them as sort of an expression of discontent, then the fact that, you know, these hashtags themselves don't have any predictive power, I think it's quite interesting because it suggests that it's only when this power is sort of seen to result in real action or protest that you get these effects.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, if I just put my measure of discontent into the regression, even loads it with the wrong sign. Yeah. So the measure. So what this here means is that discontent. So discontent on Twitter doesn't matter, or if anything, matters in the wrong direction. Yeah. So, and in fact, there's an interesting paper on China where they looked at like what gets censored, what doesn't get censored, and they find that basically the Chinese government lets people complain as much as they want. They can express as much discontent as they want on Twitter as long as they don't say let's go protest. If they say let's go protest, they immediately have filters that kick in, and that's exactly consistent with this view that basically it doesn't matter how unhappy you are until you go out on the street. There's something special about going out on the street. Okay. The last result here is kind of, I know it's maybe a little bit geeky. So we were kind of frustrated with the fact that all we had was like this daily measure of the number of protesters. So we wanted to use the Twitter data to say something about the social composition of the protesters. So what we did here is we calculated a measure of turnover in the opposition. So this is the number of users who stop retweeting the opposition leaders divided by the average of the number of retweeters today and yesterday. So this is like an employee turnover rate, basically. This is how we calculate employee turnover rates. And here this interpretation is if you have high turnover, your support base is less stable and maybe less committed. And what you see here is if you introduce a triple interaction between the turnover rate, the number of people in Tahrir Square, and the incumbent, you see a positive and significant I think these are labeled wrong. Okay, I'm confused now. So basically, so what you're supposed to see in this table, which I don't see at the moment, is that if you have higher turnover of the opposition, the effects are less. Oh no, actually it makes total sense. Okay, that's a little subtle. Okay, so you see here that the effect of protest is dampened the more turnover there is across protesters, right? So the less stable your support, for a given number of people, you have less impact. So that's what this here means. So 1 standard deviation increase in opposition turnover is associated with a 13% drop in the effect of street protests on stock returns. Okay, let me conclude. So we have many theories in economics about how constraints on rulers evolve over time. And many of these theories hinge on the idea that there is a strategic interaction between a populace that needs to solve a collective action problem and a ruler. And these sort of theories predict that when people solve the collective action problem, they should have de facto power. And what we're showing here is one instance where you can see the effects of this de facto power. So we've provided evidence that protests have played an important role in curtailing rents captured by politically connected firms in Egypt. Street protests lower stock market valuation of firms connected to the incumbent government, but have no differential effect on the valuation of firms connected to other powerful groups. That's consistent with the view, moreover, consistent with the view in the popular media. We also find some evidence that social media played a role in mobilizing for these protests. However, social media by themselves, without actual protests, appear to have no effect. Okay, thanks very much.
I think there's a bit of time for questions. So if there are any questions around the table or from the audience, feel free to ask them now. You had a question over there? Please go ahead. Can you use the microphone as well?
Hi, I have a question about the stock market in Egypt and what the significance of those falls in valuation might be. From what you presented, this stock market appears to be quite small if they have only 177 companies. And in my research on similar small stock markets, I know that liquidity is actually quite reduced. There isn't a great amount of trading taking place, so I wonder whether the valuations you picked up are actually real in the sense that there is much trading going on, and how quickly do the prices of shares recover. So is this a kind of a meaningful economic impact, or is it just a matter of momentary temperature taking in the stock market?
There was a period where you had contestability of power. There was kind of political competition.
Well, you know, this one might win, this one might win. I guess if you are in a period, it's true, protest is always a contestability, but you suppose you don't have counterfactual, where you have a period where, if you're looking, for example, at the effect of protest before, in the middle of the Mubarak, but you had some evidence, there were protests, and the stock market was not affected. So isn't it a bit the view that is the combination of protest and political competition that gets you there, well, in a sense. If you protest before would not have had the same effect, because there it was less clear that the army and even less the Muslim Brothers were serious contenders, and it plays out when you have small margins. I was wondering if there is anything in the data that you have, or maybe some extending that would allow you to test this.
What we thought is that during the period that we have, there is actually variation in contestability.
Yeah.
In the sense that there are sort of like periods, like we just had a change in power, we're not going to have another change in power anytime soon. I mean, obviously these
But you
are
look at
all
protests before. In one slide you showed, so maybe also you showed one protest before when you did your placebo or
but
whatever.
these are not protests against the government. So I think like the 25th of January 2011 is actually like it was probably the first time for a very long time in Egypt that there was actually like an explicit protest against the government, which was a big taboo, I think, before, since the 70s probably.
So is it the fact that it was a protest against the government, or is it the fact that the protests before were not at a period where it was perceived that that it's unsettled who will get power?
So
that was maybe you cannot designate.
So our prior was that if we condition within our sample period on sort of more politically stable subsets, that we would get a different coefficient.
Yeah.
Exactly from that thinking.
Yeah.
The coefficient is exactly the same.
Yeah.
That's all I can tell you. So, so our interpretation was that this kind of works. So this is some evidence for the idea that this works through sort of like directly modifying behavior rather than constitutions or something like that. Sorry, the other 100. Sorry, the liquidity question. So we spend a lot of time on liquidity. So first, the Egyptian market is sort of the biggest one in the region and the most developed by a long shot. That's why we chose Egypt. But so we kind of like tried lots of stuff with like kind of controlling for turnover and so forth. It turns out not to matter. You're right that many firms don't trade every day, but they're only in our sample if they actually trade. And the serial correlation in returns, as you've seen from the protests, is 1 day. So there's one lag that's significant, and that's it. So, so yes, the market's illiquid. We don't think it affects our results, though.
Okay, just a couple of points. So one thing in like identifying the firms that are connected to either the NDP or the military or the Islamist. But then you might think that there are also secular elites who are like those among the unconnected firms. There are elites who are apolitical, but there are also elites who are more political, right? They are either revolutionary or they have secular agenda that is, for example, I'm thinking about Naguib Sawiris, for example, among the Coptic elite and so on. So I was thinking like if you can, in some variation, extend the analysis by adding more players to the groups. The other thing is, here you're looking at the effect of the street protests, but then there is also the change in elections, right? So there was this parliamentary elections during the military rule, which the Islamists won, so I think that this also might have played a role, because in your theory it doesn't have to be the street protest only, right, that could lead to these changes. One minor comment on in the historical background, when you were showing that since 1952 Egypt had this power struggle between these three groups, I think that's a bit of a oversimplification, I would say, because the NDP did, if you look at the predecessor of the NDP in the 1960s, it was totally different. It was Nasserist, and then there was a big shift that happened in the under Sadat in the kind of political agenda of the. So we cannot just say, maybe you can say like pro-ruler or something like that, but it's not exactly the NDP. And then there is also other military elites who are. No, but there were Nasserists who were excluded for sure. I mean, it's not. But then there are also other players who were not part of these three groups. Maybe they were always marginalized, but they existed. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for a very nice presentation and paper. I'm just having a little bit of an issue with interpretation of the results. At the time of these events at the Arab Spring and so on, there was a lot of political commentary as well that was incredibly positive about these events and expected them to have a very big impact on democratization and reduced rents and corruption and whatnot. But in hindsight, I think that everybody kind of agrees that that was a bit of a hyperbole, that, you know, the positive effects were really not that great. We didn't really see much happening, in a sense, with hindsight. And in a way, when I'm looking at your results, I think of them a little bit along the same line, that what they seem to suggest, unless you can show that actual rents have come down, is that also the markets were over-expecting the positive effect on actual rents from these kind of protests. I mean, you're looking at a very local in time event, but I mean, unless you can show that these things are actually been reduced now as well, it just seems like the market was also grossly overestimating the positive effect of these kind of protests on the actual amount of rents.
Okay, should I respond?
Yeah, just a couple of points. So I think one of the reasons that you don't, one of the reasons that you may not have Islamic connected firms in your publicly listed sample is that probably there were constraints on these kinds of firms to go public. So my question is, have you looked into that, or is there any evidence on that, on constraints on these kinds of Islamist connected companies to go public? The second point is that I have a worry about using the number of protesters as capturing the intensity of a protest, because this kind of ignores the identity of protesters. So in my mind, the two biggest protests that happened were very less cohesive. So basically, the against Mubarak protests, so they included people which are pro-military, which were really honest protesters wanting the good for the country, and also Islamist supporters. And this made it really a strong protest. The same in the ousting of Morsi. So there were pro-NDP, pro-military, and honest protesters in these protests. So ignoring the identity of the protesters and the protests is also during the Morsi era, so where there were protests which were pro-incumbent government. So in Tahrir Square, for example, for the pro-Morsi, not necessarily all the protests in Tahrir were against the incumbent government. So, yeah.
So I guess what the results say is that these events are priced very well in the stock market, even by subgroups, whoever is in power. So I was wondering, I might be wrong, but I think you said you had some difficulties in finding out which firm belongs to which group. So I'm just wondering, how deep is the market knowledge? So for returns to go down, it must be very clear which firm is associated to whom. And I was wondering whether there is some heterogeneity even within political affiliations. So maybe some firms are very clearly associated to the militaries, some others are less. What happens within political affiliation? And as for the tweets, I was wondering whether you have georeferenced tweets, because I guess there is some evidence that most of the tweets, if I recall correctly, were coming from abroad. So I was wondering whether you can distinguish between domestic tweets and foreign tweets. One would be telling you something about domestic protesters and the other about the international community support, and whether this makes any difference.
Okay, so, all right, so I guess like a bunch of questions kind of were about evaluation of the success of the Arab Spring. So let me be clear. The point of this paper is that the act of protesting, so it looks like the act of protesting reduces rents. This is not to say that the Arab Spring was a success. So the protests, so I mean, you can view this like maybe the protests kind of have sort of all kinds of effects. Like one of them is Mubarak steps down, like something happens in the Supreme Court. There's all kinds of political machinations that don't happen at the frequencies that we're looking at. We're just looking at the direct effect of protests, and that's the thing that we think we've isolated. We're not claiming that the Arab Spring as a whole reduced rents. What I'm arguing is that protesting reduces rents. That's it. So I don't want to overclaim.
In the short run.
In the short run.
Yeah.
Expected rent.
You want to know whether it's right in the long run.
Yeah, then
What are
there's
the
lots
ones
of,
now
and there's lots of other,
military linked?
there's lots of other treatments that happen at the same time. And this is one, but I think this is the interesting one, right? Because that's the one that our models talk about. So, but certainly there's like more complicated political things that happen in the medium and long run that could go the other way. So I don't disagree with that at all. The NDP, the guise of the NDP, okay, so I had half a slide on the history. Of course, like in any paper like that, you have to oversimplify because there's going to have to be a dummy variable in the end that's 1 or 0. So I take that criticism. Of course, it's oversimplified. This is not like an economic history paper where we have sort of more context. Islamic connected firms off the exchange, it's very possible. We tried to figure out like what's going on there. I basically gave up at some point. So there's no data, and in particular, these guys are hiding. So what are you going to do? How else to measure intensity of protests? We spent a lot of time. We had crazy ideas. We had ideas of like taking satellite images and then calculating a percentage of headscarves and things like that. I thought it was amazing that sort of, but you know, I wrote the paper, so that's, you know, you have to take that with a grain of salt. I never thought that regressing returns on the number of protests would give you anything. Number of protests would give you anything, precisely for the reason that, you know, it's incredibly noisily measured. Yeah, even like we don't even have the exact number of people, right? So I guess we have the perceived number of people. Maybe that matters more than the exact number of people. And we have, you know, so obviously we're lucky that that in some sense the intent of protesters is relatively stable. Yeah, so you're right that there are sort of protests. Islamists come to Tahrir Square sometimes. Yeah, but the first order thing across most of these episodes is that, you know, the anti-government protesters are in Tahrir Square, and then it was very nice of the Islamists and to largely move to Rabaa Square later. But there's no guarantee. Yeah? So we didn't read the transparencies. I think, you know, if this is sort of like something that people get interested in, then you could have sort of like more complicated ways of enhancing this methodology. But you have to remember that I believe that this is the first paper trying to do something like that, where you have like a standardized event that you then pool across different dates. We also had like this idea that maybe the first protests are much more impactful than the second and the third and so forth. Turns out not to be the case. Yeah, this functional form is incredibly stable. We looked for a very long time at like the cumulated number of protesters and cumulated number of protesters squared and so forth. There's no effect. What matters is how many people are on Tahrir Square today.
Any final questions? Okay, so then that, yeah.
Is the country now more stable then than it was before? Is it ripe for investment? You've made, how can I say, you made a very interesting summary, but about the time it was in Mubarak, the fall where there was a little bit of disruption, and now it seems to be more stable. So is further change possible? Here, is the country emerging better? What's the future?
Okay, so I would want to consult a lawyer before answering these questions. I certainly our paper has nothing to say about that, right? So I find it's very important to distinguish between things that like your research speaks to, which is a very narrow question. Yeah, what is the effect of the number of people in Tahrir Square on a given day on relative valuations in the stock market? That's what my paper can talk about. Now, so I'm going to interpret your question as like asking about my opinion. My opinion is that we're nowhere near at the end of this process. I think there's now a new technology for removing rulers, which has been dormant for a very long time, or people didn't know how to do it, and people know how to do it now, and that will have consequences. And what I see at the moment is a government that is potentially more incompetent and corrupt than the previous one, and that's not the steady state. I think. But it might take a long,
The current one?
Yeah.
You're talking about CC now?
No, Morsi was particularly stupid. I mean, Morsi was particularly stupid. I mean, you know,
Yes.
I know we should discuss Egypt, but you ask yourself, you know, how come Morsi could have made a deal with the military? We were discussing this, and he didn't. And how come? How come they, you know, is it
I think
ideology? Is it because in a sense you could have felt that the army was ready for such a deal at some moment, and you have that's completely orthogonal to your paper.
And it also looks like they're out.
So we should not have the discussion.
I think that they know. I mean, maybe some of the people in the room actually consult with the government. Yeah. My feeling is that they know that they're out of their depth. I think you're right that they probably would have made a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Muslim Brotherhood was not ready to make a deal. So sometimes in history it matters who's in charge, and it's just the wrong person in charge, I guess.
Let's talk a bit further about that over coffee. There's a coffee break now. It's a very long break because it's actually the end of the program. But we'll reconvene tomorrow at 8:30 for more coffee and for a very interesting program. So thank you very much.